Oh, a union is the hope of the toiler, a pledge of the freedom we crave, a certain defense from the spoiler who would rob us from cradle to grave. When workers stand shoulder to shoulder and firmly insist on just laws, each heart will grow stronger and bolder to fight for the grand labor cause. Well, Thompson could definitely write a catchy tune. That was maybe not his greatest accomplishment. Hi, and welcome to episode 2 of season 1 of Social Democrats of the North, presented by the Broadbent Institute's Perspectives Journal podcast series. I'm your host, Dave McGrane, a professor of political science at St. Thomas More College at the University of Saskatchewan and member of the Perspectives Journal's Editorial Committee. From Confederation to the Quiet Revolution, Social Democrats of the North takes you on a journey through history to discover the lives and ideas of the leaders who have shaped Canadian social democracy. It shows how important social democracy is to the history of Canada and will give you some lessons to apply to your own political activism. In the last episode, we met a francophone from Quebec, Médéric Lanctot, who I considered to be Canada's first social democrat. In this episode, I will shift my attention to English Canada to examine the life and ideas of one of Ontario's first social democratic leaders. I'm referring to Phillips Thompson, who had a long career as a labor journalist and a prominent union leader. However, it's fair to say that Thompson did not come from a particularly radical background, and he only discovered his social democratic leanings later in life. Thompson was born in England in 1843, and he moved to St. Catharines, Ontario when he was a teenager. He came from a very middle-class family. After he grew up, he started a rather boring life working in the same insurance company as his father. Not much excitement there. But in his mid-20s, Thompson decided to get out of the insurance business to pursue a career in journalism. Over the decade from the creation of Canada as an independent country in 1867 to about 1877, Thompson rose in fame in Southwestern Ontario as a satirist. You should think of a satirist in the 1880s as the equivalent of a stand-up comedian today. There was no television or no internet, and stand-up comedy tours weren't yet a big thing in the 1880s. But humorous written texts were very popular. So satirists made their living by writing comical descriptions of their society that were published in various newspapers. As a satirist, Thompson wrote under the pseudonym Jimuel Briggs, and he poked fun at police officers, lawyers, and judges who he characterized as being too uptight and preventing everyone else in society from having a good time. It was pretty lighthearted stuff, and it made folks giggle. But as the 1870s came to a close, Thompson was coming to the end of his 30s. He really had a sense of what justice was and a sense of what justice was not. And he was starting to see things that made him question the justice of the society all around him. He moved to Boston for a couple years, where he met left-wing American political thinkers and witnessed the poverty of the working class firsthand. He then traveled to Ireland, where he wrote newspaper stories about the impoverished tenant farmers protesting high rents imposed on them by absent English landlords. In his final dispatch from Ireland, he wrote the following, and I quote him here: "In spite of blunders and crimes and defeats, in spite of the greed of the self-seeking, ambitious demagogues, through bloodshed and tears and suffering, the cause of the people will prevail by slow degrees. And the accumulated and buttressed wrongs of the centuries will be overthrown." Now, this certainly doesn't sound humorous. In fact, it sounds revolutionary. And it was gradually becoming obvious to Thompson that he had a choice to make in his life. He definitely had a very analytical mind and a way with words. He could continue to crack jokes and make people laugh, try to make them forget the worries of everyday lives through his satire. Now, that would have been the easy thing to do. On the other hand, he could take a big risk with his career and leave that humorous satire behind. That is, he could start to write things and do things that made people question the status quo and question what was really going on in their society. When Thompson moved back to Toronto in the early 80s, that's the 1880s, Thompson essentially reinvented himself by making two big changes in his life. The first big change was that he stopped writing fluffy satire for the mainstream newspapers. Rather, he started writing hard-hitting newspaper articles about working-class poverty for small radical newspapers. His articles pointed out how hard it was to be a worker in Toronto in the late 1880s. You worked long hours for little pay, your working conditions were horribly unsafe, your boss exploited you every chance that he got, and your family lived in dire poverty. From these newspaper articles, it was clear the satirist had now officially turned socialist. The second big change around the end of the 1880s was that he became a key figure in the Knights of Labour. The Knights of Labour is a fascinating organization, and it was the largest labour organization in Canada at the end of the 1800s. So I want to spend some time discussing it. Knights of Labour came out of the working class slums in Toronto. In these slums, it didn't matter how hard you worked. Your family was always struggling to get by, and your children were always shivering in the winter because of the drafty houses where you lived. What was so interesting about the Knights of Labour was that they did act like a traditional union by bargaining with employers for better pay for workers. In this way, they were similar to what unions do today and how unions operate today. But they were also very different from unions today. The Knights of Labour was also a social club. It had initiation rituals, it provided unemployment insurance to its members, it organized political debates, and it held night classes for workers on a variety of topics. It was a mixture of a working man social club and a union at the same time. As a leader of the Knights of Labour, Thompson urged all workers of Toronto to unite into one union, whether they worked with their hands or their brains. He also urged unions to create a Labour Party that was independent of the Liberal and Conservative parties. He argued that Liberal and Conservative politicians were just opportunists that tried to get into power by doing the bidding of big businessmen. He said that the workers could only really be represented by a party of workers. Thompson put this belief into action by running twice as a Labour reform candidate in the 1890s, though he did not succeed in being elected. Thompson even became quite well known for writing inspirational songs for the union members in Toronto. He published a book called the Labour Reform Songster that contained 29 songs to be played at union meetings. It's easy to imagine a gathering of the Knights of Labour loudly singing Thompson's songs on a late summer's night's evening in a tavern in downtown Toronto. Some of Thompson's hits included The Men Who Work, The Factory Slave, and 30 Cents a Day. One of my favorites is titled The Great Labour Cause. Now don't worry, I'm not going to sing it for you, but I do want to quote it to give you a sense of what it's like. It starts off like this. Oh, a union is the hope of the toiler, a pledge of the freedom we crave, a certain defense from the spoiler who would rob us from cradle to grave. When workers stand shoulder to shoulder and firmly insist on just laws, each heart will grow stronger and bolder to fight for the grand labor cause. Well, Thompson could definitely write a catchy tune. That was maybe not his greatest accomplishment. His greatest accomplishment was the publication of The Politics of Labour in 1887. I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about this important book because it could be considered, and probably should be considered, to be the first book on social democracy to be written in Canada. The Politics of Labour is a big book with a lot going on, and you'll have to read it to understand Thompson's thinking. But I can give you a flavor of the types of ideas it contains. I see The Politics of Labour as the first attempt by a Canadian to analyze how the capitalist economic system exploits workers to the benefit of big business owners. In many ways, it's both a detailed economic analysis and a political call to action. Thompson illustrates how the owners of big businesses end up receiving almost all of the profits from the businesses they own while doing very little physical work themselves. On the other hand, he shows how the workers sweat and toil for hours on end and receive almost none of the profits. This situation offends Thompson because he firmly believes that no one should receive wealth for which they do not labor. The Politics of Labour also goes into great detail about how big businessmen in Canada control the Liberal and Conservative politicians through donations to their campaigns at election time. Through paying off Liberal and Conservative politicians, big business owners are able to ensure that all the laws in Canada that are passed serve their own selfish interests as opposed to the interests of the workers. In many ways, Thompson is the first political thinker in Canada to recognize that Canada is not a democracy. That is, Canadian politics is not characterized by the democratic idea of the rule of the many. Rather, Canada is more like a plutocracy, a fancy word that means rule of the rich. The Politics of Labour depicts how the Canadian economic system works in the interests of the rich and exploits the poor that the rich employ. Moreover, the economic system is entrenched and reinforced by a political system that is manipulated and controlled by the very richest in society. These ideas may sound familiar to anyone on the left in Canada today, but Thompson was writing all this stuff in the 1880s. So we must recognize that Politics of Labour is important because it's the first book in Canada to tell this story and the first book to tell it in such detail. What does Thompson propose should be done to correct the injustices of the Canadian economy? That is, what does the Politics of Labour suggest should be done to improve the lives of working class people in Canada? It is here that the politics of labor advocates that the biggest monopolies in Canada, such as railways, banks, and insurance companies, should be owned by the government instead of being privately owned. Thompson says that, unlike privately owned businesses who solely concentrate on pursuing profit, government-owned corporations would pay their workers decent wages. And he says that government-owned corporations would give their workers better working conditions than privately owned businesses. Finally, Thompson points out that privately owned businesses mercilessly price gouge working class families in their pursuit of ever higher profits for their owners. He says that government-owned corporations will help out working families by charging reasonable rates for their goods and selling their services at reasonable prices. In these ways, the politics of labor is one of the first examples in the history of Canada of proposing government ownership as a way to reduce the poverty of the working class. As we can see, Thompson wasn't writing funny stuff anymore. Rather, he was writing things that were educating the working class about its own exploitation. And this was important work that needed to be done in Toronto and throughout Canada. However, as it turned out, Thompson's reinvention of himself as a socialist instead of a satirist was a very bad financial move. When his political views turned more radical, he was blacklisted by the mainstream newspapers in Canada who were owned by big businessmen. Unsurprisingly, these big businessmen who owned these newspapers instructed their editors to no longer give Thompson any more work. They were okay with him writing jokes, but they refused to allow him to publish articles in their newspapers about the injustice and unfairness of the Canadian capitalist system. And unfortunately, being a leader of the Knights of Labor and a journalist for small radical newspapers didn't pay that well. Thompson was standing up for what he believed in, but the pay for doing so was lousy. By the end of the 1890s, Thompson and his family slowly drifted into poverty. They ended up living in a modest Toronto home that had a pleasant exterior but lacked running water and was insufficiently insulated from the winter cold. Thompson turned 60 in 1903, but he showed no signs of slowing down and refused to retire. In the last 30 years of his life, he kept up his activism and was very happy doing so. He wrote reports on the conditions and wages of the working class for the Ontario provincial government and the federal government in Ottawa. He continued to write articles on socialism and working class politics for radical left-wing newspapers in Toronto, Vancouver, England, and the United States. He continued to run for office as a member of the Socialist Party of Canada, though he never did succeed in getting elected. And he helped found the Ontario Socialist League as an educational organization to teach workers about social democracy and to help them find ways to stop their exploitation from happening to them. By the beginning of the 1920s, Thompson was entering his 80s, and he was slowly losing his eyesight due to cataracts. Yet he was still very much a political activist. His grandson was Pierre Burton, who became a famous Canadian writer and historian in the 1960s. Burton finally remembers his 80-year-old grandfather dictating his newspaper articles to his children because he no longer could see well enough to write. And Burton reports that Thompson was still singing his Union songs in a loud, clear voice until the day he died in 1933 at the age of 89. So it seems that Thompson never regretted his decision to stop being a satirist and to become a socialist who fought for working class causes. He died a happy man who had dedicated his life to the cause that he believed in. Indeed, on the occasion of his last birthday, he wrote the following short poem to a friend. He writes the following: "We had a merry birthday party with music, song, and laughter hearty. And so, with confidence and cheer, I enter on my 90th year." I think that in a lot of ways, we're lucky that Thompson decided to stop writing lighthearted satire and turn to the more serious matters of the injustices of Canada's economy. Most economists during Thompson's life were saying that economic growth would always result if the free market was just left to its own devices. Thompson's great contribution to Canadian history was that he was the first thinker to give a real solid analytical account about how the unfairness and injustice was built into the Canadian capitalist system. He showed in a very convincing fashion that, if left to its own devices, the free market would actually produce immense wealth for business owners who already had a lot and horrible poverty for the workers who had almost nothing. In short, nobody in Canada had really pointed out before how the poverty of workers was an inevitable and systematic outcome of capitalism. Through pointing this out, Thompson provided workers with the ideas and the analysis that they needed to understand their poverty, understand their exploitations. He also gave the workers a way out. He educated workers on how the government ownership of monopolies could make the Canadian economy more just and reduce their poverty. In this way, Thompson outlined the positive role that government could play in the economy, a role that most economists of his time period completely ignored. I think that Thompson's life provides us with a valuable lesson for social democrats today. He came from a comfortable middle-class background, and probably it would have been easy for him to continue to write jokes and satire and not really get too involved in combating the injustice that he saw around him. This would have been a very natural and very human thing for Thompson to do. We're always tempted just to take the easy way out or to let someone else try to save the world. Thompson didn't give in to this temptation. He decided not to take the path of least resistance. Rather, Thompson decided to get involved in social democratic politics. And when he did, he jumped in with both feet. Despite his poverty, Thompson never regretted dedicating his life to pursuing his ideals. I'm David McGrane, and thanks for joining me on the Social Democrats of the North, a Perspectives Journal series produced by the Broadbent Institute. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave a review on your podcast platform. And share this particular podcast with someone you know who loves Canadian political history. You can also subscribe to Press Progress's award-winning Sources podcast that digs deeper into the news stories that you won't find in any major newspaper. You can read more about social democracy in the Perspectives Journal by visiting perspectivesjournal.ca. In our next episode, we'll meet a journalist from Quebec who wasn't afraid to expose the injustice of his time period, even if it got him into trouble with the law. Until then, keep questioning the status quo and stay social democratic.